Hi, everybody. I'm Diane Brady. I'm here with Charlene Lake, who is Chief Sustainability Officer of AT&T, along with being Senior Vice President for Corporate Responsibility and ESG, those words that we think about a lot. Charlene, good to see you.
Good to see you, Diane.
So I actually want to start a little bit, might be a non sequitur, but I was noticing this news. It's close to my heart because my sister's deaf, my brother-in-law's deaf, about this partnership that AT&T had with Gallaudet around basically using 5G helmets to increase communication with football players on the field. And then I thought about that was something that I saw in your LinkedIn post. Then I thought about the conversation we had at our Sustainability Leaders Summit a few weeks ago, where you were talking about the physical and digital infrastructure and that decarbonization, which made me think, what is the totality of what Charlene does? So tell us about, is this all part of your job, all of these areas?
Well, it's interesting you ask it like that, Diane. I actually would say that what you've recounted, those issues are really part of all employees' jobs at this company. That's the kind of culture that we're trying to create. So from a sustainability, a social and environmental sustainability operational function, we have always had the philosophy, let's keep that function small, because we want everybody in the company to really be looking at their jobs through this lens of social and environmental sustainability. So I love the example you brought up. This is something that we just announced yesterday about how we're using 5G technology to help the deaf and hard of hearing football players at Gallaudet University to actually be able to perform better, to be able to play on the same footing, an equal footing as the hearing players. And what I find so exciting about that, not only the social change that it's making and the impact it's making on those players and their families, but I love it because the idea for that came from an unexpected part of the company. It didn't come from an officer who had a grand idea, who got it from a consulting company. It came from somebody who was thinking about our 5G technology and thinking about how we can demonstrate more impact with that technology. And it was somebody in the company who wouldn't normally have had that kind of role, then surrounded himself with the right kind of support within the company. And so, this is now how we came to yesterday and being able to deliver that kind of technology in such an impactful way. So I think it's just a great example of what social and environmental sustainability ought to manifest itself like inside of a company.
Well, and we'll talk about this a bit, but you were the person who started certainly corporate social responsibility, which is not something we talk about much. I think that was back in 2007. Tell me about what you see your mission as today. At this juncture, we've got digital transformation. There's this push, to try and get to net zero. What are your priorities and your mission?
So we have two priorities, and they're both based on tying everything that we're doing to the core of the business. So if your sustainability work emanates from the core of the business, if it's all integrated, then you're going to have social impact, you're going to have business impact. And that's been the philosophy from day one. What I find exciting now is that with a greater awareness of what it really is externally, people are accepting and encouraging companies to admit and say, yes, I am getting a company benefit from this work that is also driving impact socially and environmentally. So from that core, Diane, we have two major priorities. One is we want to bridge the digital divide. We are all about connectivity. We want everyone connected in this world. And so bridging that digital divide is number one priority. I'd say then a close second is, how do we use our technology? How do we use our data? How do we use our data-driven technology to reduce emissions and to make our network more resilient? Because so many people, millions of people are relying on the resiliency of that network. So those are our two priorities. Both of them obviously are tied directly to the core of our business and our business strategy being all about connectivity.
Yeah, no, I think that's interesting, and especially when I think back to the way certainly sustainability, like corporate social responsibility, used to be that it had to be as far away from your core business because you didn't want to look like you were actually doing good and making a profit at the same time. You know, I've known you for let's just say several years, Charlene. I've had the opportunity to report, you know, on what you're doing in AT&T, and it. You are one of the things that's always struck me is you are a great storyteller. And I look at your background and I see, well, she actually started out wanting to be a journalist. Was that something that was a deeply held passion, or just let's try it and see how it goes?
It's interesting to think back to that, Diane. You know, I grew up in a very small town, actually a farm outside of a very small town. And I think back about what the impact of education can do to somebody and the impact of teachers on education. I went into journalism in college simply because of one comment from one teacher who said one day in a class, Charlene knows how to write. And that was it.
Wow. How old were you when that happened?
I was a sophomore in high school.
Wow.
And that one statement made me start thinking about, well, what do you do with that? If I can write, what do I do with that?
Right.
And so
Ka-ching.
it led me into, yeah. But it led me into journalism. And as I started to grow and try to understand what journalism even was, it made me realize, okay, having the ability to write and communicate is so important, not just for journalists, but for any company and for any discipline and for any function within a company. And so then my plan was, let's get a good base of writing ability under me, and then I will have the flexibility to do something else if that's something that I so
and you're
choose.
something
So
else. I think was it Southwestern Bell Telephone? I know this sounds like this is your life. I promise we'll get to. But was that the something else? What made you make that pivot early in your career?
Well, what's interesting is my college advisor said, "Hey, there's an opening at Southwestern Bell. You should apply. It's to write the company newspaper in Kansas." So it was a pretty easy transition. Because it was still writing, it was just for a different audience. And that was how I entered into the telecom business. And my goodness, how it has changed since then. And I won't say how long ago that was, but
but
it was a long time ago.
I think, you know, one of the stories that, you know, passion for education, I think is very much continued at AT&T. And the story that always stands out to me, and I'd love you to tell, is where you had a student who was shadowing you, who wanted to be a teacher. I'll let you tell the story. That's always very much struck with me as to what's wrong with a lot of education in this country. Go.
Yeah, that stuck out to me too. It was a young lady from a high school in southern Dallas, and she was talking about wanting to be a teacher, and specifically a kindergarten teacher. And so as I was probing and asking about her ambitions for education, and I brought up college, she had a surprised look on her face. And it took me a while to figure out what was going on. And finally, she said, I didn't realize I had to go to college to do that. And so it was just a stark reminder of how much we can assume in these jobs about the gap between what we know and what certain populations of the country know. The same kind of revelation came to me when we were mentoring in a high school, and we were showing individuals, here's a picture of the kind of car you might be able to drive if you have a high school education. Here's one if you don't. Here's what happens if you can have a college education, and just equating based on some third-party studies what an income level can equate to in terms of being able to buy a home, being able to buy a car. And the stunned reaction from some of these students was really stark to us, because they didn't understand the reality of what an education can actually do for you.
Well, and I think about it in the context of, you had one sentence in high school about being able to write that really pivoted you. I imagine what would happen if everybody talked about college and just made it part of their vocabulary every day to normalize it. The reason I mention that is I feel about the through line whenever, certainly a lot of the work that you've done, talk about the genesis of corporate social responsibility, because that's going back now to 2007. What did that mean at that point? And I'm frankly a little surprised there wasn't already a function. Maybe it's a very new concept, but can you talk about the role you were in and how you sort of came to that being, your role in the company at that point?
Sure. The concept itself, goodness, it was around for decades, right?
Write a check.
Yeah. And at the time, I was focused on public affairs and government relations.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought we were behind the times because we were not involved in corporate responsibility. I think that's what most people ended up calling it then, other than like citizenship.
Right.
Something like that. And what was interesting about it is when I looked around the company, a lot of what we would refer to as the work that would be under that umbrella was happening. It was going on all across this complex company.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't rationalized, it wasn't prioritized, it wasn't always tied to any effort to like measure the social or environmental impact to it. And so, I wrote the business case to make it an actual function. Mm-hmm. And being a part of government relations at the time was really perfect because, most social issues become social policy, right?
Right.
So there's a through thread there, but there's also a really direct application to the kind of work that goes on in public affairs and government relations, because there's a lot of work to connect to third parties, connect to segments of society to understand what their wants are, what their needs are. And so that kind of information and knowledge and mechanisms within the company was a really good input to the thought of, well, how do we put together, a kind of strategy in CSR that makes sense for the external world and makes sense for the internal world.
I noticed. Oh, no, go ahead. I noticed you're using the word we, but that must have been an important pivot point in your career to write out a business case for a new role is one of those actions that can take your career to the next level. Was that the case for you in this particular situation?
I think it was. And what's interesting, big companies have, for the most part, such an opportunity to provide that kind of experience to employees. And that's what I found at AT&T through all of these years, is you have the ability to pivot your role. The role I had had just before that was public affairs, which I had never done before. The company didn't have a public affairs function. I was told to go figure it out. I had to ask what it was. But then moving to CSR, it was new territory. It was something new for the company. Obviously and gratefully, our CEO at the time said, yes, we need to do this. And he did something really important at the time. He made the function a board level function. And so he changed the charter of one of our board committees and said, okay, the accountability now rests with the board. Charlene, you go figure it out.
So you reported to the board?
Yes. And actually what he did was he charged me with facilitating that board committee. So in a board structure inside of a company, usually there's an executive staff member who is the support of the board committee. So things like coming up with the agendas, understanding what issues are appropriate to put out in front of the board. So that was the function that he set in place at the time, which is absolutely critical. I didn't realize at the time just how critical it was, but if you fast forward to today, people now want
Accountability.
to understand how is that governance set up,
Yep.
and how involved is your board, and how much do they know about this kind of work. So it was a brilliant move a lot of years ago that is really even more important now.
Well, let me, because I want to talk toward the role you have now, because at one point you were Chief Sustainability Officer, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were also the Chief Marketing Officer. You seem to have these two very big roles that were rolled into one. That seems like a lot. Were they interlinked, and was there a rationale for, kind of unlinking them?
Actually, I wasn't Chief Marketing Officer. The progression was I was in the communications role,
Right.
and then I moved into advertising. So
Advertising.
that was another role that I'd not done before, and part of that was sports marketing. And then that's when I moved over to government relations to begin public affairs. And then I began corporate social responsibility. Eventually, public affairs and corporate responsibility grew big enough and important enough, we split the roles, and public affairs was concentrated in Washington, D.C. And then corporate responsibility was concentrated here at our headquarters in Dallas. So as I mentioned before, what's great
It's
is
more
that
sequential as opposed to, so I should unpack those then and make it more linear as opposed to, wide. Well, talk about sustainability. One of the challenges that I think about with sustainability today, first of all, with all of the climate change and the almost existential angst you see in the public, do you feel any of that yourself as you're in the trenches and you're trying to make changes and you're seeing the speed with which we're moving or not moving in the right direction?
I think that we have made good progress, and I'll have to admit, Diane, I'm a glass half full person. But I do think that hope and positivity really can fuel the fire of momentum, and we have made progress. When you look at the Forbes 2000 list,
thank you for referring to Forbes.
you're welcome. But that list, it had 400 companies on it in 2020 that had carbon neutrality goals. You look at today, it's got over 900. And you can say that we're not moving fast enough, and I do hear that, but we are moving. That's significant. When you look at the number of companies who have set science-based goals, science-based climate goals, it represents a third of the global economy by market cap. That's significant. So yes, it's we should always be moving faster. But I think we need to celebrate the progress we've made, because that's what helps give us momentum to continue. So I'm optimistic about it. So that's not to say it's easy, it's hard. And roles like mine and this kind of work, frequently it's referred to accountability without control, right?
Well, that's a good point. It's you could say minister without, well, you have a portfolio. But when you say accountability without control, is it because it's a staff function as opposed to a line function with a P&L and saying you'll do it or else?
In a sense, yes. It does not have, I guess what you refer to as positional power over all of the actions. So when I first started this role, I actually thought it was quite easy. I'd had relationships in the company. I'd go to my colleagues in other leadership positions saying, here's what we're trying to accomplish. They'd say, Charlene, that's great. I'm with you. Let's do it. Well, that was skimming the cream, right? So then you get to a point where, gosh, I don't have any human capital to offer you. I don't have any financial capital to offer you. I can't, but we should really be doing this. And this is why. This is why it's important to the business. It's why it's important to society. All of a sudden, it gets a little bit harder because you're changing the priorities of the leader, right? You're asking to think differently about how to spend capital, how to expend the expense dollars, how to set the priorities. And so you're changing the way they're thinking, and that's hard.
Well, let's to one thing I think to really finish up in terms of advice, because I do think AT&T has actually made some concrete goals. I see the reports every year. Since you don't have a lot of the other levers that other C-suite roles are used to, what do you think has been the most effective strategy then for moving the needle in the role that you're in?
The number one most important thing to do is to tie the work to the business. Understand the business objectives, understand how they impact social, environmental issues. So for example, when disasters happen, natural disasters happen, that impacts our network.
Yeah.
That impacts our ability to connect our customers. And so for the work that we're doing, the environmental work we're doing to make our networks more resilient, that is absolutely critical to the business. It's critical to society. It's critical to the environment. We understand the impacts of climate change now, given the work that we're doing. We're understanding it 30 years down the road, and we're building that into our network planning. We're also taking that data and we're giving it away externally, because we know that communities can be resilient only if the entities in them are resilient.
Good for the planet, good for the business, and I think that is critical. So thank you very much, and I appreciate it.